I'm Bishop Robert L. Perry Jr. I'm pastor here at Grove Street Church of God in Christ, and I also own Perry's Twin City Mortuary Service in Champaign, but we serve other areas as well.
So, could you tell me how you got your start in the funeral industry?
My music teacher's husband owned the local funeral home. I started taking my music lessons sometimes at the funeral home.
Hmm.
Didn't really have a like for the funeral home background, but we continued. Then in college, my major was in sociology and psychology. And I think that, especially the sociological aspect and the psychological aspect, began to cause me to look at the funeral industry from a whole different angle. It was not morbid, it was not something to run from. And I guess being there at the music portion or at the music lessons and observing after college, in between jobs, I helped at the funeral home and developed a like for it and realized I did have some skill and the potential to develop some expertise. I've never been to mortuary school. That's been a headache for most morticians, that I learned so much and not a licensed funeral director. But learning the aptitude for the business, and in my business, I have licensed funeral directors that work for me. But we abide by the laws of Illinois and other states that we worked in, and trying to abide in line, but at the same time, my psychological and sociological background gives me a sense of the need to go further than just business as usual when someone has a loss.
So you said you're a bishop in the Church of God in Christ, and you also, before you became a bishop in the Church of God in Christ, what was your role with the church?
Okay, I worked in what's called the adjutancy of the Church of God in Christ. Our role was to secure or dignify and assist the leadership of our church. And that starts, first of all, with the bishops. That we made sure that we became their ushers, their support team, and we made sure that the various order of the church was observed, and how they were handled and how worship services go on, and just the overall care for leadership.
So, in that being an adjutant, that also you also worked in the capacity of dealing with bishops when they make their transition. How did you get involved? How did you get that position?
Okay, another brother who's passed away, he and I were in the adjutancy together. He was ahead of me at the time as far as the hierarchy. And we both had similar backgrounds. He himself was not a mortician, but had family that had worked in the business. And we were looking at how we cared for our bishops in life. But at death, it's like we just dropped their bodies off at the funeral home, and the funeral home did business as usual. But we also studied the Catholic practices for how their leadership, especially their popes and cardinals, were handled, and said, well, our church should have the same type of order. So after a couple of years of research and pulling things together, he passed away. Then I wrote the procedures for burial of bishops in the Church of God in Christ. And it became pretty much uniform of how we do it in our denomination. Other denominations that model their procedures after ours as well.
So, just as briefly as you could you explain to us some of those procedures of how, when the bishop passes away, how the adjutant dignifies the leader?
Okay. I guess my background being in church all my life and respecting older men and especially leaders, pastors, and bishops, I would observe their services and they were just so non-reverencing, for lack of a better term. And then I looked at the Catholic Church and how they handled theirs. I said, that same thing should be given to our leaders as well. Then with my sociological, which is counseling background, and the psychology that deal with the mind background, I saw where so many areas of how we handle leadership was falling off. Then in my theological background and teaching that I received, I saw how that many of the funeral, many of us in the funeral industry have no real knowledge of quote unquote religious order. So we were very lacking. Even in my business, I studied the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm one of the few in the business that know how to prepare a Jehovah's Witness discourse. The discourse is their order of service for a funeral. So there's a lot of things that that you, and especially those of you young men in school now, that you got to make sure you understand what every specific denomination, specific religion or religious order, how it follows and what goes on. Understand that if you go to the cemetery with Islam and Muslim faith, rather than headed east and west, you're going to be headed north and south as you place the casket, and they're going to be leaning on their right side so they can look to the east. Little bitty things that sometimes we forget or don't know or never would know, but it takes away from your relationship with the family or the churches that you're serving.
Last question. What advice would you give to those who are currently in school pursuing a degree in mortuary science?
Learn everything you can. Right now, we're in the midst of COVID. Learn how to protect yourself. You know, I can remember when AIDS first came out. Now AIDS is like a common cold in the prep room. Not being a funeral director, not being the embalmer, but I study everything that's involved with my business. I can remember we had a young man that had been shot, and an intern that attended Worsham was doing his internship with us, and he was getting ready to work on the body. I walked in, I looked at the body, and the skull area, the head, as he was getting ready to deal with the putting that back together from the post. I saw a very thin area of flesh. Even the skull looked like it was thin. Just something about the body just didn't look right. I said to him, pull back. I think he may be hot. Term he may have had AIDS. And a month or so after he buried, we get the report from the coroner letting us know the guy did in fact have AIDS. So having that extra sixth sense, develop that. Learn everything you can about this business. Like I said, with this COVID, be careful. Study various religious practices, know them, and perfect yourself in the industry. It's more than a business. Don't let it lose its reverence. Don't let it lose its professionality, but be strong in knowing everything you can about the business.
Thank you so much for your time, sir.